Everyone thinks empires fall from war, invasion, or revolution. Rome was overrun by barbarians, France collapsed under the guillotine, Britain simply passed the baton to America. It all sounds neat, clean, event-driven, but it's wrong. Empires don't fall when they're invaded. They fall because they can no longer pay to stop it. The invasions come later, when the money's already gone. When the gold is missing, the debts are unpayable, and the soldiers aren't fed. Here's the truth. Every major empire in history died the same way. First economically, then politically, then militarily. The collapse always begins in silence, not with a bang, but with a spreadsheet. Before Rome burned, its silver was debased. Before Versailles echoed with revolution, France printed itself into hyperinflation. Before the British Empire let go of India, the pound had already let go of gold. Look closely and you'll see the same fingerprint every time. The money breaks before the empire does. Not after, not during. First. But we rarely notice it, because most people don't feel the currency dying until it's too late. They feel the rising prices, the shrinking rations, the angry crowds. But they don't see the hidden mechanism, the slow drain of trust, wealth, and solvency underneath it all. Even now, if you ask someone why Rome fell, they'll say corruption, decay, maybe Christianity. But few mention the coin that once held the empire together, the denarius, and how it lost nearly 90% of its silver content before the collapse. What you held in your hand became lighter, faker, and so did the empire itself. Money isn't just a tool, it's a mirror. When money collapses, it's a sign the empire already has. And the powerful know it. They always try to patch it, prolong it, or pretend it isn't happening. But arithmetic doesn't care. Gold doesn't lie. Trust doesn't grow back once broken. So if you ever want to spot the fall of an empire, don't look at the armies, look at the balance sheet. And if you're hearing this in 2025, you might want to start paying attention. If this made you see history a little differently, drop a comment with where you're watching from. Let's map the empire before it collapses again. Everyone imagines an empire as a map, borders, legions, fleets, colonies. But an empire isn't built on land. It's built on a system, a financial mechanism, a promise that the center can always extract enough wealth from the edges to pay for the whole machine. Once that extraction falters, even for a moment, the machinery groans, seizes, and eventually snaps. So let's rewind. Because long before Rome commanded 1 million square miles, before Britain ruled the seas, before the United States held reserve currency status, there was a simple idea quietly humming underneath every imperial project. Money must be more trusted than the government that prints it. That's the secret. Always has been. Rome understood this early. In the 3rd century BCE, the Roman Republic minted the denarius, a small silver coin that became the backbone of Mediterranean trade. But the magic wasn't in the metal, it was in the message. The coin told every merchant, soldier, and farmer, your work today will still have value tomorrow. That tiny psychological contract fueled an expansion from Spain to Judea. When a Roman soldier accepted his pay, he wasn't trusting the Senate, he was trusting the silver. Fast forward almost 2,000 years. It's 1694. England is broke from war with France, drowning in debt, and at risk of losing everything. Parliament approves a completely new institution, the Bank of England, a private, creditor-run machine engineered to fund empire through paper promises. This was the blueprint that would later dominate the world. A central bank backing a government that backs a navy that secures colonies that provide wealth to back more credit. A flywheel of extraction. Britain didn't conquer the world because it had ships. It built ships because it had a financial engine powerful enough to fund them. Rome had silver. Britain had paper. Different materials, same strategy. But what made these systems feel eternal was their structure. Each had 3 pillars. First, a money unit that the population trusted more than the state itself. Second, a class of creditors, Rome's equestrian order, Britain's City of London, who controlled the flow of credit and shaped policy from the shadows. Third, a political narrative that made expansion feel profitable and collapse seem impossible. You can imagine it like a vast irrigation system. Gold, silver, taxes, colonial revenues, all flowing back to the center. If the center had enough water, the empire thrived. If the channels cracked, even slightly, everything downstream dried up. Look at the Roman treasury under Augustus around 20 BCE. Revenues were calculated in the tens of millions of denarii, enough to maintain 28 legions, but only because the coinage maintained its silver integrity. The empire's power rested, literally, on a metal content ratio. Britain in the 1700s used loans instead of silver. In 1710, its national debt reached £36 million, enormous for the time, but creditors trusted that the Bank of England would not fail. That trust became the foundation on which Britain projected naval supremacy. Debt, which normally signals weakness, became a weapon. And here's the twist. Both systems were created not out of strength, but out of desperation. Rome minted standardized silver to stabilize wartime spending. Britain created its central bank because it was almost bankrupt. In both cases, crisis produced innovation. Innovation produced power. Power produced empire. But the architects behind these systems, the money men, always understood the fragility. Roman moneyers, British bankers, Venetian lenders before them, they knew that the moment the currency lost its credibility, the whole imperial structure would shake. This is why every empire develops a priesthood of finance. Not religious priests, fiscal ones, custodians of trust, guardians of the ratio between promises and reality. Because once that ratio breaks, no amount of armies or speeches can fix it. You can trace this through numbers. When Rome debased its denarius under Nero, 54 to 68 CE, reducing silver purity by roughly 10%, the Senate didn't panic. But merchants noticed. Soldiers demanded higher pay. Grain sellers protected themselves. By the time Caracalla introduced the Antoninianus in 215 CE, a coin claiming to be worth 2 denarii but containing barely 1.5 times the silver, people began to see the truth. The empire wasn't expanding. It was patching holes. Centuries later, in 1797, Britain suspended gold convertibility to finance its wars with France, letting the pound float as a paper promise. That suspension lasted until 1821. Empires don't return to sound money because they want to. They return because they have no choice. Every imperial system begins with honest money, then grows using flexible money, then survives using dishonest money, and finally collapses when the dishonest money collapses. The mechanisms were created to buy time. Time to fight wars, build fleets, expand territory, suppress revolts, and outspend rivals. But time bought with debasement or debt always comes with interest. Empires eventually discover the bill is unaffordable. So when you look back at the construction of Rome's monetary order, or Britain's, or any empires, you're really looking at a long experiment in trust management. How much can the people believe? How long will creditors lend? How far can the state stretch the gap between its promises and its reserves? History shows the same answer over and over. The gap always grows. The reserves never keep up. And the system eventually buckles under its own weight. Remember that next time someone tells you an empire is strong. Strength built on credit is still credit. It always begins with confidence. The empire has stabilized. The financial system works. People believe, not just in the state, but in the money itself. And that belief becomes the greatest fuel of all. Once the system is in place, whether it's Rome's silver coinage or Britain's central bank-backed debt, it enters a golden phase. Not always in morality, but in momentum. Growth feels effortless. Trade expands. Roads are built. Armies are paid. And crucially, everyone, from the poor to the patricians, believes it will last forever. In Rome, this phase stretched for nearly 2 centuries after Augustus. Historians call it the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. But look closer. That peace was underwritten by the denarius, a coin that for a while held over 90% silver. If you were a merchant in Ephesus or a soldier on the Rhine, you could accept payment with confidence. You didn't need to know the emperor's name. You just needed to feel the weight of the coin. That trust transformed Rome from a regional power into a pan-continental superstructure. Grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul, slaves from the Danube, taxes from Asia Minor, all flowing back to the imperial center. And that center, flush with silver, looked unshakable. Britain experienced a similar illusion. After 1815, with Napoleon defeated and industrialization accelerating, the empire exploded in reach and confidence. The Bank of England was stable. Sterling was tied to gold, and London became the beating heart of global finance. A British pound wasn't just currency, it was identity, a signal of global order. And yet, behind both illusions lay the same dangerous assumption, that money would always hold and debts could always be managed. Here's what most people miss. During these phases of peace, the cost of empire never actually shrinks. What happens instead is that the empire gets better at managing perception, better at hiding the costs through credit, inflation, or far-off extraction. Rome did it by flooding conquered provinces with Roman coins and Roman taxes, then using those to pay legions and finance urban grandeur. They even taxed in coin, forcing the use of Roman money in everyday life. A farmer in Gaul didn't just live under Roman law, he lived under Roman currency. The British did the same, but with bonds. Instead of looting physical silver, they issued debt. A colonial rebellion? Finance it with bonds. A naval expansion? Bonds. The Boer War? Borrow now, tax later. The magic trick was always in time. Push the cost forward, enjoy the growth now. And as long as the public believed, as long as the coin or note retained prestige, the machine kept humming. That belief had real effects. Rome built aqueducts, arenas, baths, projecting permanence. Britain laid down railways across India and Africa, signs of imperial inevitability. To the average citizen or subject, it felt like destiny. But underneath the surface, the mechanism was changing. Rome was beginning to stretch its military thin. Coinage was quietly being diluted. Britain was accumulating debt at an alarming pace, even as it exported capital across the globe. But in both cases, the illusion was powerful. As long as soldiers got paid, as long as banks issued loans, as long as shopkeepers accepted coins or notes without question, the belief loop was intact. And the beneficiaries, the creditors, tax farmers, financiers, they knew how to ride this phase better than anyone. Because every expansion funded on borrowed time shifts real wealth upward. Rome's equites, the knightly investor class, got rich on tax contracts in the provinces. London's financial class got rich buying government bonds, then collecting interest from future taxpayers. It was never just about armies or trade. It was about who controlled the flow of credit. And in both empires, the answer wasn't the emperor or the prime minister. It was the private financial class behind them. They were the real architects of the illusion. They weren't just watching the empire grow. They were monetizing the growth and selling the illusion abroad. But here's the trap. The better the system works, the more pressure it takes on. The more it grows, the more future promises are made. And the more those promises rest on an unspoken assumption that the money will never die. People stop asking what backs it. They just know it works, until one day it doesn't. Empires in this phase feel like they found a cheat code. Rome taxed the provinces, debased slowly, and built spectacularly. Britain borrowed endlessly, inflated discreetly, and ruled globally. But all illusions built on time eventually run out of it. If you're starting to see the pattern, write "illusion exposed" in the comments. The numbers are coming, and arithmetic doesn't flinch. There's a moment, always quiet at first, when the numbers stop adding up. The system looks the same. Coins still circulate, banks still open, taxes still flow. But somewhere, deep inside the accounting, a line has been crossed. Too many promises, not enough real value. This is the moment when arithmetic begins its silent revenge. Let's start with Rome. By the mid-3rd century CE, the empire was under pressure from all sides: Germanic invasions, Persian wars, and an economy strained by overreach. But the real collapse didn't start on the battlefield. It started at the mint. The silver denarius, once 90% pure, had been reduced to under 5% by the time of Emperor Gallienus around 260 CE. It still looked like money, but it was now mostly bronze dipped in silver wash. People noticed. What happens when your paycheck buys less grain every month? What happens when soldiers can't feed their families even though they're paid? They demand more money, more coins. More coinage means more debasement. It's a feedback loop, and it feeds collapse. By 268 CE, inflation had hit levels that, if measured today, would qualify as hyperinflation. Prices doubled, tripled, then spiraled out of control. The empire's response? Mint faster, expand the money supply, pay the troops with illusions. And just like that, the currency broke. But the money wasn't the victim, it was the indicator. The real system, the empire itself, had already defaulted. It could no longer command real value from its people or its provinces. It could only imitate the appearance of solvency through coinage tricks. Once the trust died, the legions followed. Emperors came and went, 26 in just 50 years, many murdered by their own unpaid soldiers. Rome didn't fall to the barbarians. It fell to bad math. Now let's move to London. By the early 20th century, the British Empire covered a quarter of the globe, and yet, behind the imperial banners, the financial foundation was cracking. In 1914, World War I began, and Britain, like every great power, needed money. So they did what empires always do. They suspended gold convertibility. This was the moment. The pound, long anchored in gold since 1821, was now paper backed by government decree. Just like the Antoninianus, war spending exploded. Britain borrowed £2 billion, more than its entire GDP, and instead of repaying it through taxation, it relied on inflation, foreign loans, and internal bond issuance. By 1920, prices in Britain had doubled from their pre-war level. The working class felt it first. Real wages dropped. Then the colonies felt it. Trade imbalances widened. Then the world felt it, as the pound, once the global standard, began to wobble. Still, they tried to maintain the illusion. In 1925, Churchill returned Britain to the gold standard, but at the pre-war rate. It was political theater. The gold didn't match the debt. Exports suffered, unemployment soared, and trust eroded further. By 1931, the pound was forced off gold again, this time permanently. The empire had entered its irreversible phase of decline. And the money told the story, not through headlines, but through devaluation. A pound in 1914 could buy you an ounce of gold. By 1931, it couldn't. The money had died. The empire would follow. Same pattern, different empire, different century. Mathematics does not negotiate. Once an empire owes more than it can extract and spends more than it can promise, collapse is no longer a question of if, but when. And the collapse always begins in silence, not with a crash, but with a spread between what the money claims to be worth and what it actually is, between what's printed and what's backed, between what the system says and what people feel. Rome papered over this with bronze coins, Britain with war bonds and colonial IOUs, the US today with treasuries, digital dollars, and debt ceilings. Same mechanism, just a different disguise. When currencies break, people panic, but elites, they prepare. In Rome, the senatorial class bought land, not coins. In Britain, the financial elite moved capital to New York. And today, they buy real assets, offshore accounts, and political insulation. Because they know what's coming. Once the money dies, Every institution built on it begins to wobble. Courts, armies, pensions, public trust. The collapse may take years, even decades, but the snap has already happened. You just didn't hear it. And if you want proof, look at the footnotes of history, the moments hidden between the headlines. Roman tax collectors paid in goods because coin was worthless. British India printed rupees with no gold backing. Today's banks trade trillions in credit derivatives backed by hope. The empires fall the same way because they rise the same way. Too many promises, too little real value. Too late to fix it. If you've made it this far, comment, "I heard the snap," because once you do, you'll never look at currency the same way again. If you think this is ancient history, think again. Because the mechanism never disappeared. It just got faster, more digital, and harder to notice. In Rome, it took a century for the denarius to collapse. In Britain, the decline of the pound took decades. Today, the dollar, the euro, the yen, they can lose value in months, sometimes overnight. Let's look at what came after the collapse of those old monetary systems, not the empires themselves, but the world they left behind. After Rome's money died, the empire fractured into chaos. Trade routes collapsed, cities shrank, the population declined. Europe entered what historians now call the Dark Ages, not because people became stupid, but because the light of monetary trust went out. No one wanted to accept coins that could be faked, so they reverted to barter, or hoarded gold, or paid in sacks of grain. The economy didn't just shrink, it demonetized. And who held power then? Those with land, those with resources, those who didn't rely on the currency. Fast forward to post-World War Britain. By 1945, the empire still had troops, colonies, a royal family, but the money was gone. The pound sterling was no longer the world's reserve. The US dollar had taken its place. Bretton Woods made it official. In 1944, 44 nations agreed the world would now trade in dollars, not pounds. But behind that dollar stood something else, gold. Not in your pocket, not in circulation, but in vaults at Fort Knox, the Federal Reserve, and the US Treasury. The illusion was rebuilt again. Trust us, the dollar is as good as gold. Until it wasn't. Because in the 1960s, just like Rome and Britain before it, America began to overextend. Vietnam, welfare programs, the space race, more spending, more promises, more printing. By 1971, the numbers didn't add up anymore. Foreign nations, especially France, started demanding real gold in exchange for dollars. So Nixon shut the gold window. August 15, 1971. The dollar was temporarily unlinked from gold. That temporary measure is now 50 plus years old, and since that day, the global monetary system has been entirely faith-based. Not faith in metal, not faith in balance sheets, faith in governments that owe more than they earn. Sound familiar? Here's what that world looks like. Since 1971, the US dollar has lost over 85% of its purchasing power. Wages stagnated, asset prices exploded, the rich moved from income to capital, and the middle class? They're still holding the bag, just like the Roman plebeians, just like Britain's post-war working class. Because when the money dies, it doesn't disappear. It moves. It moves from the public to the private, from wages to rents, from savings to debt, and it always flows in the same direction, toward those closest to the spigot, the banks, the bondholders, the financial class. In Rome, it was the landowning aristocrats. In Britain, the city of London. In America today, Wall Street. And behind it all, the Federal Reserve. The Fed doesn't print money in the way you imagine. It creates it, digitally, through credit, not coins, through bonds, not bullion. And who gets it first? Large banks, government contractors, corporate borrowers, those with access to low-interest capital. You, on the other hand, get it last, after prices have already gone up. They did it in the 1790s with assignats. They do it today with QE, repo facilities, and stimulus bills. New language, same mechanism. You're watching the same cycle again, just faster, quieter, smoother. And the consequences? They're already here. Countries like Argentina and Lebanon implode under currency collapse. Inflation eats away your savings without a headline. House prices rise not because they're worth more, but because your money is worth less. The average American needs 7 figures just to retire in a system where the money itself is eroding. Meanwhile, the empire still looks alive, just like Rome did in 250 CE, just like Britain did in 1930, just like the US does today. But look under the surface. The debt to GDP ratio is 120%. The real interest payments are spiraling. And global trust in the dollar, the final illusion, is quietly unraveling. China and Russia are building alternative systems. Central banks are buying gold again. Nations are settling trades in other currencies. The world is preparing for what comes after the dollar. And when the reserve currency goes, it won't be slow. The pound lost its global role in a single generation. Rome's monetary collapse took just 2 emperors. Today's system is even more fragile because it's not backed by silver, not by paper, not even by trust, just by inertia. And inertia ends the moment people stop believing. Empires don't die when their flags fall. They die the moment their money stops meaning something. You don't see it in real time, not at first, because the structures remain, the cities still stand, the government still speaks, the currency still trades. But underneath it all, the soul of the system, trust, is gone. And trust, once lost, does not return by law, speech, or promise. It only returns with pain. Rome thought it could stretch its coin, dilute its silver, and still hold the loyalty of its people. Britain thought it could paper over its debts and still call itself the center of the world. The United States thinks it can print trillions, service a $34 trillion debt, and still be the lender of last resort. Each thought it was the exception. Each believed that its currency was immune to gravity. Each was wrong. Because money, at its core, is not wealth. It is memory. It records who gave value, who received it, and who promised to return it. When that memory is corrupted by inflation, debasement, or deceit, society forgets how to function. That's when people stop investing and start hoarding, stop saving and start speculating, stop building the future and start protecting what's left. And that's when the empire is already over, even if it doesn't know it yet. So here's the warning. If you're hearing this in 2025 or beyond and your country is spending more than it earns, printing more than it produces, and borrowing more than it can repay, know this. You are not in a healthy economy. You are inside a collapsing system that hasn't admitted it yet. Empires don't collapse because of bad intentions. They collapse when the math no longer works and when no one has the courage to admit it. Rome ran out of silver, Britain ran out of gold. In this system, it's running out of time. If this opened your eyes, share it, not because you're scared, but because you're awake. And if you're awake, you have a chance to prepare. Tell me below, what's your currency, and do you still trust it?